Adari Vaal, a female geologist originally from the planet Kesh, a remote planet located in wild space, enters her house after a long day. The persecution and contempt of the entire keshiri community against Adari was reflected in physical and verbal attacks. The population abhorred the scientific practices and knowledge that Adari was trying to instill in the new generations. The inhabitants of Kesh have particular characteristics. However, there are two that are deeply rooted in themselves. One physical, where phenotypically speaking, their skin is a purple tone and can fluctuate between darker or lighter tones, and even in shades of blue to as his emotions changed. And the second one, culturally speaking, is their blind devotion to their gods. The life of the keshiri revolved around their religion, and their worship was directed to their gods called Skyborn. According to them, the Skyvern were beings who lived in the stars and had the particularity of possessing sandy blood, this being an essential element for the existence of the inhabitants of Kesh. The Skyborn were not alone. They had their enemies, the other side. Not much is known about the latter. However, it's said that they came from below. Legends say that the rivalry between these two factions reached its peak in the Great Battle. The Skyvern came into battle riding huge crystal uvak beasts against the other side, and the battle raged for eons. Eventually, the Skyvern vanquished their enemies and were victorious, although they were wounded during the fighting. This is where the anatomy of the gods makes sense for the keshiri. The blood spilled in the battle would spread in the oceans of Kesh, giving rise to the surface of the planet and its three continents: Keshta Minor, Alansiar, also known as Keshta Major, and Eshkrin, the south polar continent of the planet. Adari Vaal was always a woman of science, so her profession, geology, made her question too many things and begin to see reality with a more objective view and not get carried away by old stories. Adari began to educate with her discoveries, immediately generating the rejection of the entire society. Attacks and intimidation were what Adari became accustomed to on a daily basis, always referring to her as a heretical woman. But among all the people who rejected her, there was a particular group that always had an eye on her, the Neshtovar. Within Kesh, the Neshtovar is understood as the governing body of the entire keshiri society, whose most characteristic element is the use of creatures native to the planet called uvaks, a large membranous winged reptoavian species with sharp beaks. The Neshtovar were seen by the keshiri populace as the direct moral representatives of the gods. To sin against the Skyvern was to sin against the Neshtovar, who proclaimed themselves to be the sons of the Skyvern. Each Neshtovari exercised their religion strongly. They were indifferent to trying to understand beyond what was known. The religion did not allow it. And in addition to ruling, the Neshtovar have the authority to sentence alleged offenders who attack their beliefs. Adari's home was the gathering place of angry keshiris, with rock throwing a favorite activity of theirs. Adari's mother, Eowlin, is a mother who fulfills her duty to love her daughter, but she also didn't completely sympathize with her daughter for challenging the status quo, and she feared for the lives of her two grandchildren, Tona and Finn. Adari was partially calm with her safety within the community, since the Neshtovar exercised a tradition. The widow of a Neshtovari was always protected within the group, in addition to inheriting all the possessions of her deceased husband, and Adari was widow of Adari Vaal. Adari Vaal wasn't a brilliant individual and lacked conversational ability. His marriage to Adari Vaal, although one that only came about due to pressure from Adari's mother, was a very unhappy one. Adari held a very negative opinion of Vaal, regarding him as a fool. In addition, he had a tendency to be unkind to those around him, especially his Uvak, Nink. This being the cause of his death, when in a flight over his Uvak, Nink, Sari's constant abuse caused his creature to throw him into the ocean. This event, the fall of a rider, within the culture of the Neshtovar, was one of the greatest censures of speech, since falling was considered to have been claimed by the other side. So, within Adari's house, that wasn't discussed. The rain came, dispersing the furious roll, and Adari was able to leave her home, heading to the Neshtovars. Adari was bearing witness to the Neshtovar leader, Isri Das, or rather, they were putting Adari on trial. Within Kesh, Tav is the capital city, specifically on the continent of Keshto Minor, where the public trial of Adari was being held in the Circle Eternal. The people gathered to watch as Isri Das, according to his religion, refuted everything Adari said. While the Neshtovar criticized and intimidated the female geologist, Adari was not far behind. Her passion for her work led her to defend herself with irrefutable evidence, which were empty words for the religious keshiri. Adari's trial consisted of her discoveries, comparing two rocks from the continent but from different places, completely separated. Kesh beliefs claimed that the land was created by the spilled blood of the Skyborn, as when the lands of Kesh had been mapped, it showed a very irregular and asymmetrical coastline, confirming the belief that the land had been formed from the Skyvern blood dripping. However, Adari contradicted that belief. With tangible proof, she claims that in fact, the surface of Kesh had been formed naturally by the flow of lava. The crowd went crazy inside the Circle Eternal, and the argument with Isri Das escalated too much until a deafening noise ended the argument. In the distance, over the ocean, flames were coming out of a mountain peak. A column of burning ashes rose from the top. Throughout that same day, the harassment towards Adari was even greater. The residents of Kesh thought that this noise had been the fury of the Skyvern because of the heresies that Adari was committing. The keshiri were not very given to violence, but they didn't have much variety in their social punishments either. It was at the time when the inhabitants took torches that Adari, inside her home, feared for her safety. Cornered, Adari leaves her house and rides Nink, the former Uvak of her late husband, to fly away from her home and leave the angry keshiri behind. 2 days passed since Adari's flight. Possessed by curiosity, the direction of the Uvak's flight was towards the mountain, the place where the great smoke came from. Suddenly, she saw the origin of the columnar smoke. Adari almost fell off Nink at that moment. She was expecting to find an active volcano, the one she had studied before her trials. Instead, a massive shining shell sat in an indentation of the seaward side of the mountain. That was a word that entered her mind, even if the scale was completely wrong. Its sharp, corrugated ridges resembled the ancient conchs she'd seen return from the seabed, but this shell was the size of the Circle Eternal. And this shell had smoke, not steam, billowing from several ruptures. Tremendous grooves gouged behind the body showed that it had struck downward at an angle. The fires inside were now nearly spent, but she could tell that they must have been far larger ones. Adari tried to get as close as she could, and in one of the apertures in the shell, something appeared. Something that struck the gravel below and disappeared in a slide of dust. She nudged the UVAC nearer. A flash of crimson light appeared in the small cloud, and at its end, a man. Adari left the place terrified, riding Ning. During her flight, she tried to find a logical reason for what she had seen. However, she couldn't conclude anything, so she took courage and returned to the place. She now approached parallel to the beach, where she could observe the giant shell hanging near the precipice above her. Now, the plan would be to approach from below, carefully ascending until she could take a closer look. Upon reaching the top, she could see how the man she had seen before fell and landed on his back. At the top of the flight, Adari and the man exchanged glances, and seconds later, Adari escaped. Later that night, Adari sat, taking in what she had seen. It was there that her attention was drawn to bright lights near the base of the mountain. Adari, with fear, thought first of the Neshtovar, that they had already found her. However, a breeze blew towards the sea from the direction of the mountain. Cool, calming, to then follow a complex and emphatic feeling to describe, "We are yours, and you are ours." In the clearing below, Adari saw them. People. As many people had been at her final hearing, only gathered around multiple campfires. She again thought of the Neshtovar lying in wait for her. She strained to make out their voices as she approached. She recognized one, but not his words. She crept closer, hurtling toward the tree. Flailing, Adari slammed hard against it, collapsing breathlessly at its base. Figures rushed at her from the shadows. Scrambling, she saw them, their bodies illuminated not by the fires, but from stacks of energy emanating from their hands. Just like she had seen before, she tripped over a root. A force took her and placed her in the light of the bonfire. Adari could see the faces. However, they were not like the people she knew. Their faces were not purple like the keshiri. They were the Sith. Adari screamed, but they weren't listening. They were all around her now, men, woman, and monster, shouting gibberish. She mashed her hands to her ears. It did no good. The words were digging past her ears, digging at her mind. Mental pinpricks became knives. Adari reeled. The stranger surged forward physically and ethereally, pushing, scraping, searching. Waves of images flashed before her, of her sons, her house, her people, everything that was Adari, everything that was Kesh. She still saw mouths moving, but the cacophony now boomed inside her head. Words, senseless words. From among the crowd, his hand appeared on her shoulder, pushing her away from everyone. At that moment, all the noise in her mind disappeared. Vaguely seeing the figure, Adari thought to recognize her late husband, Sari. As her eyes focused better in the darkness, she could see a man. She had seen him before in the mountains. She had heard him before in the wind. That man was Yaru Korsin, the captain of the sea transport ship Omen. For the next few days, the Sith captors nursed Adari back to health, and quickly she learned about the identity of the Sith. For days, she was learning from the Sith, and in exchange, she gave the Sith information about the place where they had crashed. The excitement of sharing and receiving information was such that Adari even mentioned the Skyvern, stopping since it seemed painful to mention that, having seen everything that happened with that subject. Yaru Korsin mentioned to her the needs of his crew: shelter, food, and medicine for the wounded. Adari Vaal knew that in her Uvak Nink there was no room except for her, so she proposed to go for help, and she swore to return for them. Upon hearing that, a feud was born. Sila Korsin, wife of the late Adari Korsin, confronted Adari for thinking that she would abandon them. Yaru Korsin intervened in the discussion and placed a blue blanket on Adari's shoulders, reaffirming the hope that all the Sith had in her. Before Adari left, Yaru asked her one last thing: to take some time to explain to him everything about the Skyvern. After 8 days, Adari returned with the Neshtovar and introduced them to the Sith. The Sith were able to amaze the Neshtovar with their lightsabers, a technology unknown for the keshiri, and their ability to levitate objects. Seeing this, the Neshtovars were impressed by what their eyes saw. 3 days of air rescue operation had brought the new arrivals from the mountain, and during those days, word had spread. The Skyborn had arrived on Kesh. A ceremony was held in the Circle Eternal, led by Isri Das to present the Skyborn to the keshiri. Yaru Korsin followed the flow, confirmed that they were the Skyvern, causing excitement in all the inhabitants of Kesh. As a result, Adari's status was elevated rapidly, from being an ostracized heretic to the esteemed daughter of the Skyvern. Adari became the spokesperson for the Skyvern, who announced that they would reside in Tav until they could repair their starship and return to the stars. The bond between Korsin and Adari became greater as time went by, since she was the official ambassador of the Skyvern within Kesh. The plan to recover the Omen was underway. The Sith were at the crash site, stabilizing their spaceship. A route was taken shape with the Skyvern, whose number included many miners, hewing huge chunks of strata with their lightsabers. Adari already felt comfortable with the Sith, and it was in a moment alone with Yaru that she asked him something. There was a second time where Adari observed Yaru before the first contact. The first time was when she was flying in her Ubak, but the second time she could see Yaru throw something off the precipice. Adari's curiosity took her to the place where that could have fallen, and she observed that it wasn't a thing. It was a person, a man just like Yaru. Upon hearing that, the captain became visibly nervous. He asked Adari if Dad was still there. She answered no, since when she turned the body around to see him better, the tide took it away. Korsin admitted that the man was his brother Adari Korsin, but justified his actions by stating that his brother was a danger for his people. He also said that to his culture, the Sith didn't reject extermination. Yaru at one point was able to read Adari's mind and learned of the persecution of her and her late husband Sari, something that helped him persuade Adari. In the end, Korsin convinced Adari to keep the incident a secret between them. In exchange, he would teach her more things that she could imagine, more things that a keshiri could know. Adari agreed and became Korsin's student. Korsin kept his promise. Although she learned a lot, she also discovered that the Sith of Korsin, despite having amazing powers and possibly living in the stars, were not the perfect gods of legends. Adari realized that despite the immense difference in physical capabilities between the Skyvern and the keshiri, the Sith took advantage of the moment. And she wasn't ignorant like the others keshiri. However, She knew that there was still a long time before the Skyvern would return to the stars, since she had heard about some vital crystals for them, which they carried on their ship. But for that, Adari knew that there would still be time. Time that the Sith had.